one of the kind of tensions in the Trump foreign policy, such as it exists, is in this close synchronization with Russia. The Daniel Dicker perspective makes the most sense to me, that this is just all about the global and domestic hunt to exploit petrochemicals. And I've made this point myself many times in many different versions. Um, but how do you synchronize with Russia, escalate against ISIS, which we'll get to in a moment, and at the same time have the type of belligerent and confrontational approach that they've been articulating they want to have with Iran? It isn't very coherent because Russia and Iran have tight relations. And if you want to cleave Russia from, you need to cleave Russia from Iran. And apparently that's not happening. Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, traveled is on his way to Moscow, and he and Putin are promising to coordinate in Syria, fight IS, and also go into larger projects of infrastructure, technology, and energy exploration. And I'm going to quote now briefly from Reuters. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said on Monday that Tehran welcomed Russian investment in its gas and oil fields, signaling major development in energy cooperation between the two countries. There's huge potential for Russian investment in Iran's energy sector, Rouhani told reporters at Mahrabad airport before departing for Moscow. Some gas and oil fields have been suggested to oil companies, and we'll see a big development in energy cooperations. So the Russians don't have the same perspective on Iran, obviously. And in order to get that cleave, I would have thought that you would need to somehow undermine that relationship. But that's a major incoherent split as it stands now. They're all belligerent towards Iran, but Michael Flynn was the most belligerent, and was a guy who, along with many other conspiracy theories and delusional things he believed in, had an obsessive and fanatical relationship with Iran. So maybe he provides some reprieve. In Mosul last week, it was reported that U.S. Air Force is providing air support for the Iraqi army in light of new rules that the Trump administration has pushed through, which are basically a looser burden on bombings and much less concern over civilian casualties. There were reports that last week, airstrikes killed as many as 200 Iraqi civilians, according to an Iraqi officer. Quoting now, this was a report that came out of Dubai's Al Khalij, and quoting from Juan Cole, who summarized it. After U.S. airstrikes on West Mosul on Thursday that is alleged to have killed over 200 innocent civilians, the Iraqi army has paused its campaign to take the rest of the western port city. That is, Trump may have actually hamstrung the anti-Daesh fight by policies that led to civilian massacre from the air. The Iraqi Observatory for Human Rights is reporting that an Iraqi civilian defense force is reporting that 500 corpses of civilians killed by airstrikes have been discovered in Mosul. If we go back to what led to the modern iteration of IS, it actually has a couple of different influences. One is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was a ruthless fighting force that began, and terrorist organization that began after the invasion, which not only targeted U.S. troops, it also targeted many Shiite civilians and Sunnis that didn't see things the same way. It was an organization that was so brutal that Osama bin Laden actually sent word to the former head of it that they should de-emphasize murdering as many Muslims with car bombs and other forms of terrorist attacks as they were doing. Then you had the Sunni awakening, which basically meant that Sunni tribes were co-opted through diplomatic arrangements and money, and they came on the side of the Iraqi government to some extent and U.S. forces and helped tamp down on terrorism and control their own neighborhoods. Then you had a a Shiite government come to power in Iraq that was interested in retribution and not reconciliation, which led to deep repression of Sunnis and, in some cases, supporting militia groups which engaged in massacres and other horrific human rights abuses. That meant that back in 2014, when you saw the stories of IS taking places in Iraq, some of those stories were basically just Iraqi Sunnis seeing IS as a form of essentially militia units that could protect them from government abuse and abuse from Shiite militias and maybe offer them some dignity and jobs. Now, of course, we all know what IS is, and many people rightly reacted against that. But I just, because they're not going to be popular with most normal people because of how grotesque and brutal and fanatical they are. But I just say that all that to say that obviously the subtext of all of this is U.S. killing of civilians, U.S. interference in Iraq. And you can see quite practically here that these civilian casualties are disrupting a strategy that was going to be put into play. And then I make the final addendum point, which is that if you were out suggesting that Donald Trump offered a less interventionist foreign policy, one that was going to lead to less deaths of less innocent people, well, you definitely should be owning up to your massive delusion right now.
Hey folks, Sam Seder here. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses. And one way he can is by you subscribing to this channel. I don't know how that works.